The candles in Blackfang Castle burned lower with every passing night, and yet no one dared to speak of what was coming. Not out loud, not where the walls might carry the words to unfriendly ears. For 23 days, the kingdom of Mooncrest had held its breath, waiting for a king who no longer opened his eyes. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us return to the story. High above the courtyard, ravens gathered on the parapets of the ancient stone towers, circling in slow, patient loops, as though they already understood something the healers refused to admit. Inside those towers, the corridors had grown quiet in a way that unsettled even the bravest guards. Servants no longer whispered hopeful rumors about the king's recovery. They bowed their heads and hurried past his chamber, because hope, it seemed, had quietly been buried alongside expectation. King Ryden, the strongest alpha to rule in generations, a man whose roar had once scattered armies across distant battlefields, now lay motionless beneath heavy blankets, his breath so faint that even the flame of a single candle barely stirred when held near his lips. The healers had stopped arguing over remedies. The priests had stopped praying with any real conviction. Everyone, it seemed, had already begun to mourn a man who had not yet died. Everyone except one person. From the tallest tower overlooking the courtyard, Beta Commander Cashin watched the ravens gather with something unreadable behind his eyes. His advisor stood beside him, his voice low, careful, as though even the walls of the tower might betray their words. "They always gather when death draws near," the advisor murmured. Cashin said nothing at first. He only watched the birds circle, his expression calm, almost peaceful, in a way that would have troubled anyone who understood what truly lived behind that calm. "Tomorrow," he finally said, "or perhaps tonight. And when the Alpha dies," the advisor asked. Cashin's lips curved, slow and quiet. "Everything will belong to me." Neither man noticed the young servant girl who had paused just outside the door, a stack of fresh linens pressed against her chest. She had heard every word, and though her hands trembled, she said nothing. She simply lowered her head and disappeared down the corridor before either man could turn and see her face. Her name was Fauna. No one in the castle ever looked twice at her, not because she lacked anything worth noticing. Quite the opposite, but because she had learned long ago that beauty was a dangerous thing for an Omega without a family name to protect her. She kept her eyes low. Her worn brown, cloak-concealed hair the color of moonlight, and her long sleeves had faded scars around her wrists that she never spoke of to anyone. Most of the castle staff assumed she was simply quiet by nature. Some assumed she couldn't speak at all. She had never bothered to correct them. Silence, she had discovered, protected her far better than words ever could. And yet, every single evening, once her duties were finished and the other servants had gone to rest, her feet carried her toward the western wing of the castle, toward the king's chamber. She never stepped inside. She only stood outside those massive carved doors listening, hoping, praying for some small sign of life behind them. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the corridor outside the king's chamber stood empty. No guards, not sleeping, not distracted, gone, as though they had vanished from their post entirely. Fauna felt a chill crawl slowly across her skin. She glanced in both directions, searching the shadows for any explanation, and found none. Every instinct she possessed told her to turn back, to return to the safety of her small attic room and forget what she had seen. But something stronger, something she could not name, held her in place. Her fingers brushed against the cold bronze handle. The door creaked open barely an inch, just enough for a sliver of candlelight to spill across the marble floor. She knew she should close it. Instead, she slipped inside. The chamber felt colder than the depths of winter itself. Thick curtains blocked out the moonlight, and dozens of candles flickered weakly around an enormous bed. There, beneath heavy blankets, lay the king. His golden hair had lost its shine. His broad shoulders no longer rose with the quiet strength that had once commanded entire armies. His hands rested peacefully atop the blanket, arranged so carefully that it almost seemed as though someone had already prepared him for his own funeral. Fauna stopped breathing. It wasn't that he looked like death. It was that he looked utterly alone. No advisor stood at his side. No Yenidas. No family. Only silence and the soft, uneven flicker of candlelight. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she even realized she was crying. She wiped it away quickly, embarrassed by her own emotion, and stepped closer to the bed. "You protected everyone," she whispered. "So why is no one protecting you?" The room offered no answer. She laughed softly under her breath, the sound trembling with sadness. "Listen to me," she murmured, "talking to a man who cannot even hear me." She took one hesitant step closer, then another, until she stood directly beside him. She looked down at the Alpha King she had quietly loved for over a decade, a love she had never spoken aloud, not even to herself. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed the words until they felt like memory. And yet now, standing so close to him, every word she had prepared refused to come. Instead, she reached for his hand, then stopped herself. "I shouldn't," she whispered. "I'm only a servant. You wouldn't even remember me." If only she had known the truth. Inside the darkness that held his body prisoner, Ryden heard every word she spoke. He had heard every voice that had entered that room over the past 23 days. Every healer who had quietly given up, every noble who had begun dividing his kingdom in hushed conversations, every servant preparing for a funeral that had not yet come. He had screamed inside the silence. He had fought with everything left inside him. And still, his body refused to obey, trapped like a man drowning beneath frozen water, aware of everything and able to change nothing. But then, for the first time in 23 endless days, he heard something different. A voice that made the darkness itself feel warmer. Her voice. Soft, gentle, trembling with tears she was trying desperately to hide. "Who are you?" His thoughts strained toward the sound, searching for an answer his memory could not provide. He could not place her, and yet something deep within him, something older than memory itself, recognized her completely. For the first time since falling into that endless sleep, his heartbeat quickened, only slightly, barely enough to make the candle flames tremble. Fauna did not notice. No one did, except for one person. Hidden behind the heavy velvet curtain near the window, a pair of amber eyes slowly opened, watching her with quiet, careful attention. "So," the figure whispered, "it's you." Fauna froze the moment she heard the voice. Every instinct in her body told her to run, and yet her legs refused to move. Slowly, she turned toward the shadow near the window, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be heard across the room. An elderly woman stepped into the candlelight, her silver hair braided beneath a dark hood embroidered with the royal crest. Fauna's breath caught in her throat. "Your Majesty," she whispered, dropping immediately to her knees. It was Queen Dowager Alara, the king's own grandmother, a woman the entire kingdom believed had long ago retreated into private seclusion due to illness. No one expected to find her standing quietly in her grandson's chamber long after midnight. "I'm sorry," Fauna stammered. "I shouldn't be here." The queen studied her in silence for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You've been coming every night," she finally said. It wasn't a question. Fauna's stomach turned to ice. She had been discovered, and she knew exactly what punishment could follow such an intrusion. "I never meant any harm," she whispered. "I know. You could have me imprisoned. I could. You could have me executed. I could," the queen repeated calmly. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching until Fauna could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, to her complete surprise, the elderly queen walked toward the bed rather than toward the door. She looked down at her grandson's still face for a long moment before speaking again. "Tell me," she said quietly, "when you stand beside him, what do you see?" Fauna hesitated, terrified that this was some kind of test, one that could end her life with the wrong answer. Finally, she whispered the only truth she knew. "I don't see a king," she said. "I see the man who once knelt in the mud, so a frightened little girl wouldn't have to cry alone." The queen's eyes lifted to meet hers, something flickering behind them that Fauna could not quite name. "You remember that day," the queen said softly. "I've remembered it every day since." The queen nodded, almost imperceptibly. "So has he." Fauna blinked, startled. "What?" But the queen only caught herself and shook her head. "Nothing," she said quickly, brushing a strand of golden hair from her grandson's forehead. "The castle believes my grandson is merely sleeping," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "But I have watched him long enough to know his soul is still fighting." Deep within the silence that held him prisoner, Ryden heard every word. He recognized his grandmother's voice instantly, and something inside him strained desperately toward the sound, toward the possibility of being heard. "Grandmother," he thought, "please, tell them I can hear every word." He forced every fragment of strength he had left toward his fingers. Nothing happened. His eyelids remained sealed. His lips refused to move. His body had become nothing more than a prison built from his own flesh. And yet, whenever Fauna spoke, the darkness around him did not feel quite so heavy. He didn't understand why. He was certain he had never truly seen her face. At least, he believed he hadn't. But something inside him stirred whenever she drew near, as though a memory long buried beneath years of war and duty and responsibility was slowly beginning to surface. "Who are you?" he wondered again, the question echoing endlessly through the darkness. The following evening, Fauna tried desperately to stay away from the western wing. She scrubbed the kitchen floors long after the other servants had gone to rest. She polished silver until her hands ached and cracked from the cold. She even volunteered for extra duties in the kitchens, anything at all to keep her feet from carrying her back toward that chamber. It didn't work. As darkness settled over the castle once more, her feet carried her there anyway, as though pulled by something far stronger than her own will. This time, the guard stood alert outside the king's door, and she lowered her head as she passed them, careful not to draw attention. She should have turned back toward the servants' quarters. Instead, she slipped behind an old, forgotten tapestry hanging along the corridor wall. Behind it, a hidden stone passage stretched into darkness beneath the castle, one the Queen Dowager had quietly shown her the night before. Cold air brushed against her face as she moved through the narrow corridor, ancient torch brackets lining the walls, long unused by anyone but the queen herself. No servant should have known this passage existed, and yet the queen had trusted her with it. Fauna could not understand why, but she pushed the question aside and continued through the darkness until a hidden panel opened silently behind the king's chamber. She stepped inside. Ryden lay exactly as he had the night before, still, silent, waiting, though he could not have known it himself. She smiled sadly at him. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted quietly. Inside the prison of his own body, Ryden felt something close to relief wash over him. "You're here again," he thought. "Thank the moon goddess." Fauna pulled a small cloth bundle from beneath her cloak, revealing a worn, leather-bound book with yellowed pages. "My mother used to read this to me," she said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. "I thought perhaps stories might sound less lonely than silence." She opened the book and began to read, her voice gentle and warm, filling the cold chamber with the tale of a lonely wolf who believed strength meant never needing anyone at all. Ryden listened to every word, and though the story itself was simple, her voice carried something far more powerful than the tale itself. For the first time since entering that endless sleep, he did not feel alone. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the castle, Commander Cashin entered the royal infirmary, where the chief healer stood waiting, his face pale and drawn. "You asked to see me," the healer said quietly. Cashin closed the door behind him. "I have a simple question," he said. "How much longer?" The healer hesitated before answering. "The poison is progressing." Cashin's expression softened into something almost pleasant. "So the king is dying?" "Yes." "And no one suspects poison?" "No." "They must never suspect," Cashin said, leaning closer, his voice dropping into something far colder. The healer lowered his eyes, his hands trembling at his sides. "My family," he whispered. "Exactly," Cashin said. "If you wish to see them alive, you will continue telling everyone this is simply an illness." The healer said nothing more. He hated himself for his silence, but he had no other choice left to make. Unaware of the conversation taking place elsewhere in the castle, Fauna closed her book, the chamber falling quiet once more. She looked toward the sleeping king and reached out carefully, resting her trembling fingers lightly against his hand. Inside the darkness, Ryden poured every last fragment of strength he possessed toward that single point of contact. "Move," he begged himself. "Please move." A sharp pain shot through his arm. Then, so faintly that anyone else might have missed it entirely, his smallest finger twitched. Anyone else would have missed it, but Queen Dowager Alara, watching quietly from the hidden doorway, did not. Her eyes widened in the darkness. He responded, she whispered to herself. But why only when she touches him? The Queen Dowager did not move. She scarcely dared to breathe, her eyes fixed entirely on her grandson's hand. Had she imagined what she'd seen? No. She had spent 23 days watching every rise and fall of his chest, every shallow breath, every motionless finger. She knew precisely what she had witnessed. His finger had moved only after the Omega, Maid, had touched him. The queen slowly stepped back into the shadows before Fauna could notice her presence. Not yet, she told herself. Not until I understand why. Fauna, unaware of what she'd just witnessed, smiled sadly down at the sleeping Alpha. I suppose I imagined it, she murmured, gently withdrawing her hand. The moment her touch disappeared, Ryden felt the warmth vanish along with it. No, he thought desperately. Don't leave. Please stay. His thoughts echoed endlessly through the darkness that imprisoned him. It was no longer simply loneliness he feared. Her voice, her presence, had become his anchor to the world of the living. Without it, the silence threatened to swallow him whole once more. By morning, whispers filled the palace once again. Another healer had failed. Another remedy had accomplished nothing. Servants exchanged worried glances as nobles gathered outside the council chamber, and inside, Commander Cashin stood before the royal council, his face carefully arranged into the perfect mask of grief. My friends, he began solemnly, our beloved Alpha King grows weaker by the hour. Several council members lowered their heads in sorrow. Cashin sighed heavily, as though the weight of the kingdom rested entirely upon his own shoulders. The kingdom cannot remain leaderless forever, he continued. We have waited weeks already. Our borders grow unstable. Our enemies are watching closely. If His Majesty cannot recover, someone must prepare to lead in his place." No one argued. His words sounded reasonable, responsible, exactly as he had intended them to sound. Only one counselor noticed the faint satisfaction hidden behind Cashin's carefully sorrowful eyes. Lord Garrick, the oldest wolf in the chamber, whose instincts whispered that something was deeply wrong, though he had no proof to offer, not yet. Far below the council chamber, Fauna knelt beside a stone basin in the servants' quarters, washing blood from torn bandages. Old Berta, the elderly laundress, shuffled beside her, studying the young Omega with knowing eyes. "You've been disappearing every evening," Berta said quietly. Fauna nearly dropped the cloth in her hands. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. Berta only smiled. "Of course you don't," she said, leaning closer, her voice dropping low. "But listen carefully. Someone has been asking about you." Fauna's heart skipped. "Ooh, I don't know," Berta admitted. But they weren't palace servants. They wore traveling cloaks, and they carried silver wolf emblems. Fauna felt the color drain from her face. Silver wolves. It was impossible. They couldn't have found her, not after all these years. Could they? That evening, rain lashed against the castle windows as thunder rolled across the distant mountains, driving most servants indoors early. Perfect weather, it seemed, for keeping secrets hidden. Fauna slipped once more through the hidden passage beneath the castle, carrying something different this time. Not a book, not flowers, but a small, crudely carved wooden wolf, its edges uneven, its shape barely recognizable. She laughed softly as she placed it beside his hand. "I carved this when I was 13, she admitted. "You probably don't remember, but you once told me that every gift holds the heart of the one who gives it." The moment the rough wood touched his fingers, a memory burst through Ryden's mind like lightning, splitting the darkness. A frightened little girl. Mud. Zen. Tiny trembling hands holding a badly carved wooden wolf. "I made it for the bravest person I know," the memory whispered. Golden sunlight. A shy smile. Silver eyes. The memory vanished as quickly as it had come, but Ryden's heart pounded violently within his chest. Fauna. Her name exploded through his mind with sudden, undeniable clarity. The little girl. The one once accused of stealing. The child he had defended so many years ago. It was you all along, he realized, unaware of the memory she had just unlocked. Fauna had never noticed the hooded figure watching silently from within the hidden tunnel behind her. The stranger had followed her. They had seen everything, and most importantly, they had discovered the secret passage into the king's chamber. An hour later, Commander Cashin sat alone within his private study when a soft knock came at his door. "Enter," he called. The hooded figure stepped inside. "I found her," the spy reported. Cashin looked up sharply. "The girl?" "Yes. She enters the king's chamber every night through another passage beneath the castle." Cashin's eyes narrowed. "There's something else," the spy continued. "The king's pulse. It became stronger while she was with him." For the first time in weeks, genuine fear crossed Cashin's face. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The poison should have silenced his heart by now." "I only report what I witnessed," the spy said quietly. Cashin walked slowly toward the window, watching rain hammer against the glass, his own reflection staring back at him, cold and calculating. "If that Omega truly holds the power to wake him," he said quietly, "then she must disappear before the king ever opens his eyes." Completely unaware of the danger gathering around her, Fauna stood beside Ryden's bed, gently tucking the blanket around his shoulders. "Sleep peacefully," she whispered. "I'll come back tomorrow." She turned toward the hidden doorway and took one step, then another, then a third. Deep within his imprisoned consciousness, a strange and ancient voice suddenly echoed through Ryden's mind. one he hadn't heard since childhood. Only the blood of the Moon Guardian can awaken the sleeping Alpha, the voice whispered, reverberating like distant thunder. Moon Guardian? He wondered, what could that possibly mean? Before he could grasp any further meaning, the darkness swallowed the voice once more. At that very same moment, far beyond the castle walls, deep within the ancient crescent forest, an old blind seer suddenly opened her clouded eyes. The child has returned, she whispered into the empty forest around her, and the moon goddess has begun to wake. The following morning, Commander Cashin stood before a roaring fireplace within his private study, his thoughts racing beneath a calm exterior. The poison had been perfect, laced carefully into the king's wine, a rare substance called moonshade root that only a handful of healers across the entire continent could even recognize. No antidote existit, or so he had believed, and yet the king's pulse continued growing stronger, all because of a simple Omega Maid. He summoned his spy once more. I don't want her arrested, he said coldly. I don't want questions, witnesses, or rumors. I want an accident. Meanwhile, Fauna lay awake in her small attic room, unable to find sleep despite her exhaustion. The Queen Dowager's words echoed endlessly through her mind. Spirits here. Could it truly be possible that the king had heard her all along? When sleep finally claimed her, peace did not follow. In her dream, she found herself standing beneath an enormous silver tree glowing beneath a full moon, surrounded by hundreds of glowing wolves who watched her without any hint of threat. A woman dressed in flowing white stepped forward, her silver eyes shimmering like moonlight upon still water. I have been called many names, the woman said gently. Guardian, Mother, Moon, but you may simply call me Selene. The Moon Goddess? Fauna whispered, falling to her knees. Selene showed her visions of an ancient battlefield, where a young warrior stood beside an Alpha King, carrying nothing but a silver spear. When the warrior turned, her face became Fauna's own. The Guardian's blood never disappeared, Selene explained softly. It waited for someone whose heart remained pure despite suffering. Only the Guardian's blood can call an Alpha's spirit back from the edge of death. You will understand when the moon turns crimson. The dream shattered, and Fauna woke gasping in the darkness of her small room. Outside, a single wolf howled, and within moments, the entire forest echoed with haunting cries that sent chills through every servant in the castle. Old Berta whispered nervously that the wolves were mourning. But the Queen Dowager, watching the moon from her tower window, knew better. No, she whispered. They're welcoming someone. Before dawn broke over the castle, the royal healer hurried in for his morning examination of the king, only to find something that made his hands shake uncontrollably. The heartbeat was stronger. Not by much, but undeniably stronger. Every sign pointed toward the impossible. The Alpha King was no longer simply dying. He was fighting to return. Torn between fear for his own family and guilt over the lies he had been forced to tell, the healer made a decision that would cost him everything. He quietly removed a page from the king's medical chart, the one describing the poison's steady progress, and whispered a quiet apology to the sleeping king before hiding it away. Hidden just outside the chamber, a pair of amber eyes watched everything unfold. The spy smiled to himself. There would be another death for Cashin to arrange. Far beneath the ancient castle, in tunnels forgotten for centuries, something began to stir. An enormous stone door, covered in glowing runes, trembled, dust falling from the ceiling above as one symbol after another slowly ignited with silver light. A deep, ancient voice echoed through the darkness. The Moon Guardian has returned, it whispered, and for the first time in hundreds of years, the ancient door began, ever so slowly, to open. Commander Cashin, growing desperate, met with a hooded assassin from the feared Shadow Fangs deep within abandoned armory beneath the western tower. He offered gold in exchange for a single, simple task. An Omega's servant, he explained. She must die before tomorrow's sunrise. The assassin accepted the contract without another word and disappeared silently into the darkness. Meanwhile, in the royal kitchens, Fauna prepared warm herb broth, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Old Berta studied her carefully, mentioning her own grandmother's old stories about a silver tree and wolves that bowed rather than attacked. Stories she called the dreams of the guardian. Fauna's hands trembled so violently that the bowl she held slipped and shattered across the stone floor. Elsewhere, within the forgotten royal library, Queen Dowager Alara discovered an ancient chronicle titled the Book of the First Moon, containing a prophecy that confirmed her deepest fears. If the guardian fell, the Alpha would fall beside her. That evening, as Fauna returned once more through the hidden passage, carrying wildflowers for the sleeping king, the assassin waited silently among the stone rafters above, dagger ready. But something about the young Omega gave her pause. She wasn't plotting. She wasn't scheming. She was simply bringing flowers to a dying man. Still, when the moment came, the assassin moved. A dagger flew silently through the darkness toward Fauna's back. At the very last instant, Ryden summoned every fragment of strength left within him, slamming his hand against the bedside table hard enough to shatter a vase and startle Fauna out of the blade's path. The dagger buried itself into the stone wall exactly where her heart had been only moments before. The assassin, witnessing a man in a coma defend the very woman she'd been sent to kill, felt something she had never experienced in her entire career. Fear. She vanished into the darkness without completing her contract, leaving Fauna staring in confusion and quiet terror at the dagger embedded in the wall, and the Queen Dowager, watching from the hidden doorway, finally understanding the full weight of the prophecy she had uncovered. Word of the failed assassination never reached the wider castle, but the tension within its walls only tightened. Commander Cashin, furious at the assassin's failure, began questioning his own certainty. Meanwhile, deep within his own private turmoil, the royal healer decided he could no longer live beneath the weight of his guilt. He wrapped his journal of confessions in cloth and set out through the castle corridors to deliver it to the one person he still trusted, the Queen Dowager herself. He never made it. A hidden assassin's blade found him on the staircase, but with his final breath, he hurled the journal over the railing, hiding the truth just out of his killer's reach. His last words, spoken to the guards who found him, remained unfinished, but his sacrifice would not be in vain. A young palace page, named Elias later, discovered the journal hidden beneath an old cabinet, its cover bearing 4 chilling words. The king was poisoned. Terrified but determined, Elias resolved to deliver the journal to the Queen Dowager himself, unaware that Cashin's spy had already begun hunting him through the castle's shadowed passages. Cornered within the old chapel, Elias narrowly escaped death when an enormous black wolf, glowing with unnatural light, burst through the doors and stood between him and the assassin's blade. The creature vanished like mist once the danger had passed, leaving only a few silver hairs drifting through the candlelit air. At that very moment, deep within his own imprisoned mind, Ryden found himself standing in a moonlit meadow, facing an ancient wolf spirit named Fenrir, the guardian of Alpha souls. Fenrir explained that Ryden would need to pass through 3 sacred trials: truth, sacrifice, and forgiveness, if he ever hoped to open his eyes again. Above the castle, the full moon suddenly turned the color of blood, and every wolf across the kingdom lifted its head and howled as one. The Queen Dowager, watching from her tower, understood immediately what it meant. "The trial has begun," she whispered. Within the first gate, Ryden confronted the painful truth of Cashin's betrayal, witnessing memories of false loyalty and secret poison poured into his own wine. Within the second gate, he was forced to choose between his own life and Fauna's, and without hesitation, he chose to remain asleep forever rather than allow harm to come to her. Within the final gate, he faced Cashin not as the traitor he had become, but as the frightened, lonely orphan he had once been, and found within himself the strength to forgive the boy while still holding the man accountable for his crimes. Fenrir bowed his great head. "You have passed," he said. "The kingdom has its king." At that very moment, within the waking world, Fauna held Ryden's hand and whispered through her tears that she did not care whether he ever wore a crown again. She only wanted him to come home. A single tear fell from her eyes onto his hand, and then his fingers closed around hers. Not a twitch, not a tremble, a firm, deliberate grip. Fauna gasped as the Queen Dowager rose so quickly her chair crashed to the floor behind her. Ryden's chest rose sharply, and slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. Golden, bright, alive. The first face he saw was hers. "So," he whispered hoarsely, "it really was you." Within days, Elias delivered the healer's journal to the Queen Dowager, and the evidence proved undeniable. Commander Cashin was arrested before the entire royal council, his crimes exposed by both the journal and the assassin herself, who stepped forward and confessed everything rather than protect the man who had hired her. Cashin was sentenced to exile beyond the northern mountains, never again allowed to set foot within the kingdom he had betrayed. Weeks later, before an overflowing great hall filled with nobles, warriors, and villagers alike, King Ryden knelt before Fauna in front of his entire kingdom. "When I wore a crown," he said, "I believed strength meant leading from above. You taught me that true strength kneels to honor those who stood beside us when we had nothing left." He took her hands gently in his own. "Fauna, you saved my life. You saved my soul. And if you will have me, I would spend the rest of my life earning the love you gave so freely." Fauna, through happy tears, simply nodded. "Yes." The hall erupted into applause, and outside, beneath a silver moon, the wolves howled once more, not in mourning, but in celebration. In the months that followed, the kingdom changed. No child was judged by rank. No servant was ever again ignored. And whenever visitors asked how such a transformation had begun, the elders always answered the same way. It began with the quiet voice of an Omega who refused to stop believing in a king who could not answer. And from that day forward, mothers told their children a simple truth passed down through generations. Never underestimate a kind heart, for sometimes the softest voice carries enough strength to awaken an entire kingdom.